Okay, so let's talk about the test on Wednesday, what it's over, and the common mistakes that people make when they're studying for this one. Um, it is over the whole brain notes, right? And then the third set of nervous system notes, which was spinal cord and spinal nerves and autonomic nervous system. Most common mistakes that people make in any set of notes is forgetting to study the last page. Okay, very, very commonly happens. They're like, know it, know it, know it, got it. Well, I want you to know that the last part of the spinal cord and spinal nerves has you responsible for knowing the muscles that are innervated by every single one of those nerves. And the successful student would certainly do that if they wanted to do well on, for instance, a short answer portion. So make sure that you do that. With the brain stuff, you have got to spend enough time that you get comfortable with the terminology. So if I say frontal cortex, you should be able to go, okay, I'm in the cerebrum, right? I'm in the superficial 4 centimeters of the cerebrum. I'm in the frontal lobe. And then you start thinking about functionality. But if you have just studied superficially, then even if what I think is a clear question is written, you're going to get thrown by terminology. So you need to spend enough time that you get comfortable with the terminology. I do not try to write tricky questions over the brain. I try to write them pretty straightforward, but people get thrown by the terminology. So I'm not going to write them tricky, but it doesn't mean that you're going to know them. So please, please do spend some time. I would like for you all to do well, but the words are big and the structures are unfamiliar, so you're going to have to do that part. I think about maybe slightly less than half of the test is brain. And then I'm not promising this, but just proportionally, I would say slightly less than half brain, and then probably almost equal proportions heart, and maybe a little bit more of the other nervous system stuff, and the least about heart. So this is a guesstimate, 50, 30, 20. Right? Just based on how much time we ended up spending on it. But I mean, you're not going to hold me to that because I'm not going to say it for sure. And I haven't written it yet or finished writing it yet. I'm almost finished. So anybody have any questions over the test? Everybody good? Go ahead.
So blood is not going to be
No. I don't even know if we'll get to blood this semester, actually. I may do an assignment for you for blood, but we'll see. Okay, so. Oh, I also posted, I know that you guys don't have time until after your test, but I posted for you under assignments and announcements one of my favorite neuroscientists, his name is Robert Sapolsky, wrote an article that is he's really funny, he's a great science writer. He's from Stanford. He's a primatologist and neuroscientist, and he wrote an article about the changes in the cerebral cortex, the frontal cortex, in the adolescent and teen brain to adulthood. And it's super duper interesting. Either you were one, or you are one, or you have one, right? So it's really good. He's really funny. He talks about, the article starts with, okay, so there's this cave system in California. And when we discovered this cave system, you walk for a really long way, and then there's like a 180-foot drop-off. And once they finally started exploring the cave system that's been there since like early portion of human history, they found all of these skeletons at the bottom. And then they started to examine the skeletons, and they were like, you know what they had in common? They were all adolescents, most of them boys. Because this sort of risk-taking behavior that is inherent in like development of the adolescent brain. In addition, like it's among the most creative times of your life, the times in which you're really open to things and you're like super passionate about things, especially things related to your peers. And he talks about the why in the development of the adolescent brain, which was really interesting. I wish I had known it when I was an adolescent. I've been like, I'm going to get this thing under control, man. I'm going to make it work for me. Right? It didn't. It just betrayed me. Okay, so it's a great article. It's a little long, so you might want to break it up, but it's pretty phenomenal. He's my favorite. Okay, so we barely were about to start about pulmonary circulation. Is that right? Okay, so we just talked about the pressure differences between pulmonary and systemic circulation. Okay, And now let's just get into pulmonary circulation, which is, by the way that you have to learn about it is relatively easy. There's not a whole lot of detail in your textbook about pulmonary circulation. So, but remind me of the things that I know that you know, and that is that pulmonary circulation will go from which chamber of the heart? Right ventricle back to the left atrium, exactly. So pulmonary circulation is sometimes also, of course, referred to as the pulmonary circuit. Okay, and what's going to happen as you go through the pulmonary capillaries is you're going to change gas content. So let's just briefly talk about the basic vessels that are involved in there. First off, the artery that is going to go, the big artery that is headed for the lungs is called the what? Pulmonary trunk, which will then split into the left pulmonary artery and the right pulmonary artery. Everybody good with that? Now, they don't show them on this figure, but I'm going to tell you because you have to know eventually anyway. The right lung has 3 lobes and the left lung has 2 lobes. So if you followed those right pulmonary artery and watched it splits into 3 lobar arteries, one going to each lobe, right? And then the left pulmonary artery splits into 2 lobar arteries, one going to each lobe. That's easy to remember because it's try to do right and buy what's left, just like the valves, right? So that's not hard. 3 right lobes, 2 left lobes. Go ahead. Just seems to be an evolutionary anomaly, just developed that way in organisms that are way, way older than us. Most mammals have that. Okay, so now, so what's going to happen is we are going to deliver this low oxygen blood to the lungs. And it's going to go through these arteries, and then ultimately it's going to split and split and split into smaller arteries and then arterials. You don't have to know the names of all the smaller arteries and arterials. Ultimately, what it's going to do is it's going to head to the pulmonary capillary beds. But the pulmonary capillary beds are weird looking because their function is very unique. Elsewhere in the body, I'm delivering blood to a capillary bed, which is then going to exchange with the tissues, right? Here, I'm delivering blood to a capillary bed, which is then going to exchange with the air. Does that make sense? So these capillary beds are going to end up looking really weird. So this is what the capillary beds look like in the lungs. So I want to follow, so make sure that you guys are going to understand. So if I followed something all the way up, this would ultimately, this deoxygenated vessel right here, would ultimately be tracked back to the pulmonary arteries, yes? Okay, and it's going to deliver blood. It's going to deliver blood into, collectively they're called the pulmonary capillary beds, but just so you know, they actually split into individual little capillary beds, each of which covers an alveolus. An alveolus is in a microscopic air sac that actually, there's trillions of them in your lungs. So what's going to happen is this alveolus is made of simple squamous epithelium, right? And I breathe in air that's high oxygen content, right? And then what's going to happen is this capillary is going to run by it. It's also made of simple squamous epithelium, right? So very little impediment to exchange that you've got going there. So what happens as the blood goes by, just follow this one right here. As the blood goes by, it's of course going to diffuse carbon dioxide into the alveolus, but more importantly in this context, it's going to diffuse oxygen into the alveolus. Right? And so the color and the gas content of the blood is going to change as you go by each of these 1 trillion alveoli. And then, of course, now that the blood is richly oxygenated, I can send it back into the pulmonary veins, which will be headed back to where? Left atrium. Okay, so let's just talk about how much of this there is. When I was a kid, I don't know why, maybe you guys thought this too, or maybe you've always been smarter than me, I don't know. Whatever. I thought that your lungs were like hefty bags, right? You just like breathe in, and there's like this big bag that fills up and empties and fills up and empties. But then you would have very little gas exchange surface area, right? Okay, so what it really is like the thickest, densest, like Williams-Sonoma sponge, right? You know, the thick, dense ones. Have you seen those? Like the expensive sponges, right? So the really expensive sponges have teeny tiny little holes, and they're really dense when they get wet. That's what your lungs are like, tiny, tiny little holes. And if you squish the lungs, it doesn't collapse like a hefty bag. It's got a lot of stability in it because it's actually made of all of those microscopic little alveoli. If you spread out the lungs of an average sized person, it's about the size of a tennis court. That's how much surface area you have for gas exchange. Tremendous surface area for gas exchange. So let's just do a little clinical application here and talk about one of the things that smoking can do to your lungs. One of the things that smoking can do to your lungs, and I want you to figure out what effect this is going to have to you, is smoking can take those little grape clusters of alveoli and take them from being individual grapes to take them to being like a mandarin orange, right? So instead of a bunch of little ones, it busts apart into one big one. And then as it gets worse, instead of one big mandarin orange, you become a grapefruit, right? So what's happening during this process of emphysema is what I'm talking about, is you're losing surface area for gas exchange. Can you imagine any problem associated with that? Yeah, it's harder to breathe, and even when you do breathe, you don't get as much oxygen into your system, right? And so your tissues are cut off from oxygen. Does that make sense to you? So this is this whole surface area thing. Interestingly, most of us don't breathe all the way into our lungs most of the time. We do when we're working out. But one of the things that stops you from doing it most of the time is my posture's like this, guys. And the lobes of my lung go all the way down here. My posture's like this, and then I try to breathe in maximally. I can't get as much air in, right? And then you change your posture, and you can get air all the way down to the bottom lobes of your lungs. And it does make a pretty big difference on gas exchange. So one of the things that like yoga and Pilates and those kinds of things teach you is to sort of realign your body so that you can get better gas exchange. And it's not all hippy-dippy BS. There actually is some good science in there. The orientation of your body can actually change how much air you effectively get in. Okay, so now, we got it back to the pulmonary veins. We're going to make it back to the pulmonary veins. Now, usually there's 2 right and 2 left pulmonary veins, even though there's 3 right and 2 left lobar arteries. Every once in a while, somebody will have 3 and 2, and it's usually 3 right when they do. 3 right pulmonary veins, but not always. Okay, so now we're going to move on to systemic circulation. And of course, systemic circulation is going to be a way, way bigger story than pulmonary circulation. So systemic circulation, I'm going to tell you guys the way that I think about it so that you can sort of start to predict the way that I will test about it, okay? And so when you're in lab, here's what most people do. They just point to a vessel and they name its name, okay? And that's all well and good, but it doesn't tend to give you a lot of retention. And what I'm going for you guys with in lecture is always putting memorization into a context that it becomes portable so that you actually retain it for later. So I tend to ask different questions. In addition to, for instance, asking this vessel, I might ask you which direction is blood flowing through that vessel, okay? Where can you trace it back to, right? Always back to the aorta with systemic circulation. What's the gas content in that vessel? And then by the time we get a little more into it, I will ask you, what is that vessel supplying? Like, is it supplying the muscles of the thigh? Is it supplying the brain? Is it supplying the whatever? Okay, so when you think about arteries, the way that I think about arteries, you think about them not by naming them. You think about what are they supplying? What is that artery delivering blood to, right? And so then you would be able to trace it from where it comes from, which is always the aorta with systemic circulation, right, to the capillary bed that it ends up with. And by forcing you to do it that way, you are always thinking about blood traces, right? And not just identification of vessels. Eventually, you will have to do blood traces for me. I won't make you do any until after your test, but you'll be doing some in lab this week, and then you'll be doing some next week with me. They get to be really, really easy because there's some consistencies. So think about arteries not just by where they are, but also by what they supply. Most of the arteries you're going to be learning are systemic arteries. And if I followed any systemic artery back, do you see that I could trace every single one of them to the aorta? Yeah? Every single systemic artery could be traced to the aorta, right? Okay, so, and then let's just talk about veins, big picture, before we get into the specifics. Okay, so what do veins have in common with arteries and what do they have different? Well, first off, of course, they're going to be way lower pressure. We already know that. We learned that before. Second, they're more variable. Okay, they're more variable in their branch points and their numbers. And there is an evolutionary reason to this that I hope will make sense to you. So if we just think about systemic circulation for a second, I think of an artery as being on its way to work or on its way to school. right? It's on its way, and it's very imperative that it actually gets there. If you're anything like me, you're always almost late, right? Especially once you have children. Oh my heavens, I like literally haven't been on time for anything in 10 years. You don't really have a lot of time for farting around. So there may be 72 alternate routes to get to work or to school, but it's not like you have time to explore those, right? Okay. So can you see that as far as evolutionary pressure goes, if I, for instance, developed an alternate route of circulation to my brain, right, but it was less efficient than yours, can you see that I might be slightly more likely to pass out and get eaten by the tiger than you are, and therefore that particular trait is less likely to get passed on? And so what tends to be retained evolutionarily is the most direct route of arterial circulation, and not a whole hell of a lot of variation compared to venous circulation. With venous circulation, if you're on your way home, especially if you're inactive on your way home, you're like, on your way home, you can go 72 different ways. It's not really that big a deal, okay? So there's less evolutionary pressure on the direct route for venous circulation, lots more variation between people, which of course means anatomy students hate it because they're like, what the hell? You just said it branched over here and now it branches over there. There is a way to figure out what they're doing in just a second. In addition, there's lots more veins than there are arteries because they act as a blood reservoir holding a disproportionate amount of blood at any given time. And then second, there's way more superficial ones. Any idea why superficial arteries are not incredibly common?
Because if you get that, then
Yeah, right. You don't want to nick a superficial artery and start squirting everywhere just because you like ran into the coffee table, right? Okay, so ran into the how did you die? I ran into the coffee table. It was a good life. So there's more variation, but just so you know, you don't actually learn in this class twice as many veins as there are arteries. You don't learn them all. You do learn some superficial ones. It is a little bit difficult. So how do you, for instance, know that a vessel is, if it's variable from person to person, how do you know what vessel it is? Well, you think about what veins do. Instead of just labeling the vein, you figure out what the vein is draining. Okay, so you say arteries supply and you follow it to a capillary bed, right? But veins drain and you follow them from a capillary bed. So what if my inferior mesenteric artery was in a little bit different place than yours? Well, then I look around and I go, okay, I'm going to find the vessel that goes from the last part of the colon, the distal part of the colon, and I'm going to follow it back up. That's how I know that it's the inferior mesenteric vein, even if it doesn't look like the picture, okay? And sometimes they don't look like the picture. So veins drain and you follow them. Now, ultimately, you're going to follow them all systemic veins are going to dump ultimately into which chamber? Right atrium, and they're going to do it by way of three possible vessels and only three. What are they? Superior vena cava is if it's coming from the head and the arms. Inferior vena cava is if it's coming from the below there, right? And one more, coronary sinus coming from the heart. So what you will see as you start doing traces this week, next week, whenever you start doing them, is that traces get pretty easy with systemics because without exception, it's going to start out with the aorta, right? And without exception, it is going to end with the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, or coronary sinus, right? So you know the beginning and the end of the story. And then the middle part is the only time it varies, right? And you know that in order to do a trace, you're going to have to make it cross a capillary bed, or else it's not going to be able to get from arteries back into veins, right? So eventually the traces just become iteration after iteration after iteration of something that you did before, right? Which is tiny little differences. It's not very hard. The traces are not very hard. Blood traces are not very hard. Okay. So now let's start talking about the approach to blood flow. So we're going to do systemic blood flow. And what we're going to do is we are going to follow it. The way that I like to do it is everything comes from the aorta, right? Okay. So I'm going to do branches off the ascending aorta and then branches off the, what comes next? Aortic arch, and then branches off the descending aorta, right? And so that's kind of what gets blood in what order, right? Starting from the heart, okay? But It actually gets really easy because we've actually already done the only branches off of the ascending aorta. And what are those? Nope, ascending aorta. The only branches off the ascending aorta are the coronary arteries, right? And we already did them, okay? So this just reinforces what we talked about before. What is the organ that gets first dibs on systemic arterial blood? The heart, okay? So we deliver it via the left and right coronary arteries, right? And then ultimately all of that venous blood is going to come back up and dump into what vessel? Coronary sinus, and then back into the right atrium. Okay, so what I'm telling you here is that even though I'm not going to go through this in detail again, this is part of the systemic circulation story. They always cover it on the heart because you can see it on the surface of the heart, right? But it's actually important to me that you understand that this is actually a part of this story, right? Okay, so we don't have to go through it again, but that probably means it's going to be on your fourth test too. Okay, all right, so now next part of the aorta. So let's take off all the details and just look at the actual aorta. Okay, so no more heart. We actually did the coronary arterial circulation and everything, and now the next part of the aorta is the aortic arch, right? Okay, now with almost all of us, the aorta arches left. Okay, arches over to the left side. Okay, so there are 3 branches off of the aortic arch, and I'll make it make sense to you if you let me. So this first branch right here, you didn't do them in lab yet, did you? Okay, so this first branch right here is called the Brachiocephalic Artery or Trunk, and it's telling you what it's supplying. Brachiocephalic. What's it going to supply? Arm and the head. Exactly. Okay, so we'll come back to that in just a second. And then this next branch over here, do you see it? This is called the left common carotid artery, okay? And it's implying where it's going because you've met carotid before, where? In the skull. So that one's going to go to the head, okay? Okay, and then this guy right here is called the left subclavian artery. So it's going to go subclavian, under the clavicle, which probably means it's going to shoulder and arm, okay? So now, let me show you something, and this is important because people get confused about this. So what I have over here is I have this little branch that's jogging off to the right side called the brachiocephalic, and that is related to the thing that I just told you. The aorta goes left, so if I want to give blood supply to the left side of the head and the left arm, I can do it directly off of the aorta, okay? But if I want to give blood supply to the right side, I have to jog back over there, okay? So watch what this brachiocephalic does. The brachiocephalic then splits into the right common carotid and the right subclavian. Okay, so I just have this little vessel, extra vessel right here because I need to get back over the right side. Does that make sense? Okay, so if you're doing left side circulation, you go directly off the aortic arch to the left common carotid and the left subclavian. But if you're doing right side, you have to jog over to the right side via the brachiocephalic, right? And then you have to give rise to the right common carotid and the right subclavian. That makes sense? So that's really the only difference. And by the way, once you get into the common carotid and the subclavians, the circulation is exactly the same after that. Okay? So after you've split into the common carotids and the subclavians, the same. Okay, so now what we are going to do is give blood supply to the next thing that gives dibs, which is not surprisingly the brain. The brain gets dibs next. Okay? So arterial blood supply to the head. Okay, so let's watch. So what we're going to do is see if you can orient yourself if I flip this way. Okay, I'm looking at the right side, so stick with me. Okay, all of the blood before it was in the brachiocephalic was in where? Aortic arch, exactly. Okay, and then here's the brachiocephalic artery, right? And then it's going to split right about the level of the thyroid. Splits right here, and it's going to split and go right, sorry, thyroid gland, sorry. It's going to go right common carotid. Now, if you see a common vessel, it's going to split, okay? If it's common, it's either going to split to internal and external or superficial and deep or something. It's usually going to split into 2 vessels that are named very similarly. So this guy right here is the right common carotid. which is then going to split into the external carotid, and you can pretty much see where the external carotid is going. Do you see it going pretty much to the outside of the head? Like the skull, the skin, the musculature on the outside of the head. And then this guy right here, do you see this guy? This is the internal carotid that goes through a hole you know. Carotid canal of the what bone? Ooh. Temporal bone. Ooh, that's been a while. Get that off of there. Carotid canal of the temporal bone. And this guy right here with its partner on the other side, 75% of the blood supply to the brain goes through those two. The two internal carotid arteries, left and right. Okay, and we'll come back to those in just a second. Okay, so I just got 75% of the blood supply to the brain. Okay, I just delivered blood supply to the outside of the skull and the head. There's a whole bunch of other vessels, by the way. You guys don't want to know them all, do you? Okay, there's going to be enough. Okay, and then what about the other 25% of the blood supply to the brain? Well, let's get that. Okay, so watch. However I get into a subclavian, over here it's brachiocephalic then subclavian. On the other side it would just be aortic arch then subclavian. But however I get to a subclavian, the subclavian, one of its first branches is this guy right here, which is called the vertebral artery. And it runs through the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebrae. Okay? Right and left vertebral arteries are going to go up the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebrae. And here's what they're going to do. They are going to go up through the transverse foramina, and then they are going to dive anterior to the medulla oblongata, right? And then they're going to go up the foramen magnum to deliver the other 25% of the blood supply to the brain. Is that good? Okay, so now I've got all the blood supply to the brain, and we're going to look at it collectively and figure out how the brain keeps from having strokes very often at all. So what are the two vessels, two pairs of vessels that give blood supply to the brain? Internal carotid arteries and? Not external. Vertebral arteries. Okay, so now let's flip the brain and look at it from here. Not that one. Here we go. Okay, so these two right here that are coming right by the optic chiasm are the internal carotid arteries. Do you see those two? Okay, and then these two right here that are going anterior to the medulla oblongata are the vertebral arteries. Does that make sense? And then the vertebral arteries are going to go up and come together as this artery called the basilar artery. They just go up and come together. And the basilar artery runs through that depression like the cleavage in the ponds, you know, that little depression in the ponds. That's where that thing runs. So now this is an important story because this is basically a circle of arteries that you end up with. It's called the cerebral arterial circle or the Circle of Willis. Why is it important? This is a phenomenal example of collateral or redundant circulation because I want you to think about this. What if somebody has a blockage right there? Do you just say, oh, it was great having this part of my brain, see ya? No, it goes all the way around to give blood supply that side, right? What if you have a blockage right here? Well, you give blood supply over here, and then you go all the way around to give blood supply that. Do you see this redundancy in the circulation pattern? And the fact that these four vessels are collectively responsible for delivering the blood supply to the brain, and each one of them is fully willing to take over for the other ones if they are actually not functioning properly. So this is called the cerebral arterial circle or the Circle of Willis, and I am actually a living example that this collateral circulation works. So I'll tell you guys my little story of this. It was really interesting when it occurred. Apparently I almost died, but I didn't, so it's okay. So here's what happened. So you've got these two vertebral arteries, and they're going up the transverse foramina, right? Apparently, I didn't know, but I have like this abnormality in my blood vessels that makes them, the walls kind of weak. And when I have like really high blood pressure, they can balloon out. So what happened, I was going through a super stressful time in my life. I almost got a divorce. I didn't. My husband and I were separated. I hated everything, wasn't eating, wasn't taking care of myself. You know, those stressful times in your life. And I'm sitting on the couch, and all of a sudden, it goes from relatively silent to this noise in which I can hear every single pulse radiating through my skull. So it goes from silence to whoosh, 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 whoosh. Like you could sit right next to me and hear it. And I couldn't figure out what the hell was going on, but of course, my life was falling apart, so I didn't go to the doctor, although I probably should have, don't you think? So I didn't go to the doctor. I was like, I'll deal with that later. So I didn't go to the doctor, but it was so loud that I would have to like do this if I wanted to hear somebody in a loud room. I couldn't sleep anymore without white noise that was louder than that because it was so incredibly loud. But I didn't do anything about it until my life leveled out a little bit. At that particular moment, I almost died. But anyway, when my life leveled out a little bit after a few months, I went to my cardiologist. And she was like doing the heart stuff. She's listening to my heart. I have a little heart problem. She's listening, and I was like, everything's cool there. And then I was like, hey, while you're here, will you just like take your stethoscope and like stick it up here to my skull? And this is literally what happened. She took it and she stuck it up there and she goes, oh shit. And it's not good when your doctor goes, oh shit. I was like, you gotta work on that. That was not subtle. So she sends me to a vascular specialist up at the U. And he's a researcher, and he does sticks some dye up my femoral artery, gets it all the way in there so you can see how the blood is flowing. What they figured out was that, so in each transverse foramina, each side, you have a vertebral artery and a vertebral vein that are running together. I haven't taught you about the vertebral vein yet. So what happened is my vertebral artery just blew a gasket, and it started dumping directly into the vertebral vein, and it was bypassing the capillary beds in my brain. So I just lost 12.5% of blood flow, like right there at that moment. But apparently, since I lived, right, the other vessels compensated for it, right? They compensated for it. So they basically could stick the dye in there and then see it dumping directly into the vein without going through the capillary bed. And so he let me watch the diagnosis. Like they actually did a catheter up my femoral artery all the way up, and I could see it going up, and he put the thing in front of me so that I could see it. And then he showed me when he squirted the dye in there, and I could see it going through. And then so he got the diagnosis, and then I said, well, so what are we going to do? Like, should I just leave it? Because apparently I didn't die. And he said, Melanie, you know better than that. So he said, what can you tell me about the pressure that an artery can sustain and the pressure that a vein can sustain? So I thought, okay, well, it's going to be fine. It's just going to be super loud for the rest of my life, and I might be insane by the age of 60, right? But no, what was happening is I was dumping high-pressure blood directly from an artery into a vein. And he's like, is that sustainable long-term? He's like, no, that is not sustainable long-term. So our choices at that point were he could go in and try to repair the artery, but the problem is that during the reparation process, you might form a clot, and then that'll get sent directly to my brain, right? So the other possibility was to just shut that artery off, since it was apparently not killing me anyway. So we went with option 2, and he went in and stuffed $30,000 worth of platinum coils all the way up here. I got to see him do it all the way till it got to right below my brain. Then he's like, sorry, you have to go sleep now. And he put me asleep. And then he stuffed the platinum coils up there and just kept shooting the dye in there to see when he got all of the blood flow, right? And then as soon as he got all of the blood flow, then he opened up the coils and shut down the blood vessel. And then because of collateral circulation, I'm still alive, because all the blood that wasn't going up there just basically compensated with the others. Now, I might be like 10 IQ points smarter if I had that blood in my brain, but I can't tell the difference because this is the only brain I've got. So anyway, that's collateral circulation, and it's actually, I don't think it's worth anything on the black market, so you probably shouldn't kill me. I don't think it is. That's pretty cool. That's like way more valuable than my car, my wedding ring, all of that stuff. Okay, so anyway, the vessels that you guys are responsible for are the left and right vertebral arteries, the left and right internal carotid arteries, and then this one, which is the basilar artery. Notice that there are a whole bunch of others. I want everybody to learn those, but I keep getting overridden in the lab manual. Everybody's like, Melanie, but it's brain stuff. You guys know how I feel about brain stuff. It's like literally the best stuff. Okay, so this is also called the Circle of Willis. Okay, so let's do venous drainage of the head, and then I'll let you guys go. So we just got blood to the head, and now we have to get blood back from the head. You guys with me? Okay, so ultimately, let's think about venous drainage is a little harder to think about. So what I want to ask you is, what vessel is it all going to end up in? ultimately? Superior vena cava. Does that make sense? It's all going to end up in the superior vena cava. So my only question is, how do I get it there? Well, ultimately what you are going to do is, this is the internal jugular vein, yes? And the internal jugular veins are going to join to form the superior vena cava. So the internal jugular vein is going to go through the jugular foramen. It's going to join with the external jugular vein. Those two are going to form the brachiocephalic veins, and then it's going to dump into the superior vena cava. I'll show you them. But we also have to add one more thing. Do you remember that we had all of these dural venous sinuses? You remember these? Okay. You guys will learn these in lab this week. Not all of them, but most of them. But I just want you to watch what's going on. So think about direction of blood flow. So the superior sagittal sinus is going to be going this direction, yes? Follow it down, and lo and behold, it's going to end up in the internal jugular vein. So are all of the other ones. Do you see that? So all of the internal ones are going to end up in the internal jugular vein. So now, the internal jugular vein pretty much is responsible for draining the inside of the head. Okay? So now let's get the rest of the head, okay? And then we'll put it into, ultimately, the superior vena cava. So now let's look at this part, okay? So follow with me. Here's the internal jugular vein, right? Now follow from the outside of the head. Outside of the head all the way down, this is the external jugular vein. Do you see that one? Okay. The external jugular vein dumps wherever the hell it wants. Sometimes it dumps into the subclavian, sometimes it dumps over here. But how do you know it's external jugular? You follow it from where it came from the outside of the head. Okay. Here's the vertebral vein. Do you see that? Okay. Ultimately, those are all going to come together, and they are going to form this guy. And this guy is going to come together with the subclavian to form the brachiocephalic vein, okay? Because it's head and arm, okay? Just a second, Rhett. Let me do one more thing, and then I'll answer your question. Okay, so let's look at it from here, okay? So do you see this is the internal jugular vein, right? This is the external jugular vein. This is the subclavian vein. When they all come together, that's when you call it the brachiocephalic, because it's got head and arm. Okay, and then the two brachiocephalics join to become the superior vena cava. Okay, what was your question?
On the other picture,
If
if you look at the middle vein on the outside of the skull, it goes into the internal.
Yeah, some of them do. Yeah, there's little, I'm not teaching you all of the circulation patterns, I'm trying to simplify it. So the simplification, which is always a little bit of a fib, but we're trying to get some anatomy out of it. The simplification is this, you ready? External jugular vein pretty much drains the outside of the head, and it drains into the subclavian, okay? Internal jugular vein pretty much drains the inside of the head, and it drains into the subclavian, okay? This one isn't on the other picture, but this is the vertebral vein that ran with the vertebral artery draining into the subclavian. So when do you become brachiocephalic? It's easy. When you gathered up arm and head, then you are brachiocephalic, right? And you have, one last thing, two brachiocephalic veins. How many brachiocephalic arteries do you have? One. On which side? Right side. Good. Okay? Yeah? Because you, yeah? So it's the union of the two brachiocephalic veins that makes the superior vena cava. Good? Okay. So it takes a little practice, but it's okay. And you're not going to be tested over it until December 7th or whatever.
Last test.
Last test is like December whatever.
Well, is that our last test? It's not the final.
Yeah.
I've been doing good.
Yeah.
Are any of these notes on the test?
No, the vessel notes are not on the third test. They're on the fourth test. It ends with the heart.
How do you do the final? Is it like
Comprehensive.
so? It's everything. Is it our biology teacher did it? Or did you take questions directly from the test? And find this out?
About 60% of the questions will be directly from the test.